Hope everyone enjoyed their holiday season. I know that between the two family dinners that I went to, I was having to be rolled out of each one, but I'm glad everyone's here this morning, and I hope that you are going to be able to focus on what we're going to be going into, because as we have been discussing the past couple Sundays, we have been discussing a series dealing with the authority of God. Not only dealing with the authority, but also the institutions that He implemented to express authority here on this earth as well. We started off by talking about the family and the importance of the family, the structure of the family. The next thing we discussed was we talked about the church, the structure of the church, the authority of the church, the leadership roles within that church. But this morning we get to talk about the one that's not quite as fun. It's the one that people really struggle with, especially here in the United States, and that is the government. God establishing government. Now, as any good American would say, it's liberty above all else. And sometimes we have established ourselves in such a way that the government is to be the enemy at all times. We keep them at arm's length at all times. But the reality is, government was not put in place by you and me. Government was not put in place by men coming together and saying, okay, let's see what kind of a government we can come up with. No. Government was implemented by God. Was put in place by God in order to deal with certain issues that mankind had. Now, God is not going to sit here and from His cloud in heaven going to strike down every single person who does wrong. No, that falls to us to establish law and order. But God gave an implementation for what government was supposed to be. Not just anything at all, but He said, here is the role of it. But He also deals with what our relationship as Christians should be to the government. But let's first of all discuss this point, the purpose of the government. The purpose of the government. In America, we have a constitution that's established to describe the relationship between man, the citizen, and the government itself. And oftentimes the role of the government, at least here in the United States, is for protection and to ensure freedoms. That is the structure that was put in place. That was what they tried to establish. But God had specific reasons for the government as well and what they were supposed to do that goes beyond what even our Constitution describes. But what is He talking about? Well, first of all, we understand as a foundation here, God is over earthly authorities. Under any circumstance, God is the supreme authority. He is the one that gave us life. He's the one that gave us breath. He's the one that gave us the very earth that we live on. He gave us the materials we have to build our government buildings. God is in charge of absolutely everything. We see this in Daniel chapter 4 and in Daniel chapter 5 as well, where God makes Nebuchadnezzar, the great king of Babylon, the leader of the mightiest empire of that day, to crawl on all fours like a beast until what? He knew that God rules in the kingdoms of men and giveth them to whomsoever He will. Now we get to Daniel chapter 5 and we see another king that came after Nebuchadnezzar, and he begins to think some of the same things. In fact, he throws a banquet for his people, his princes, and he uses the very golden vessels from the temple that the Israelites had put in there. Now think about if you are God watching this take place, those are relics that were given for your purpose. And here is this pagan king using those for simply a party. God was not going to allow that to stand. Now we also know from Daniel chapter 4 that God had prophesied the fall of Babylon. He prophesied what was coming. He said Babylon is going to be destroyed. Another nation will take its place. For now you are the head of gold. You are beautiful, wonderful, incredible, but it's not going to last forever. Another nation is going to take over, and that's exactly what we see in Daniel chapter 5. The Medes and Persians assault the kingdom of Babylon and overtake it in a night. This great empire that had conquered most of the known world fell in one single night. For all of human history, nations believe they are the most important thing. At one point in time, Poland, the nation that we tend to think of in a result with World War II, and they were the nation that was overtaken very quickly and don't quite think of them as a powerhouse in the day. Back many, many years ago, they were one of the greatest empires in Europe. The nation of Austria-Hungary back in World War I was one of the superpowers of the day. Now you look on a map and they're barely even noticeable. The reality is nations rise and fall just like seasons come and go. God is the one that stays consistent. So for me to understand that first and foremost, that God is in charge, really it comes down to what does He say in result to this? Because I can feel a certain way in reference to authorities. I can say I hate this authority, I hate that authority, but at the end of the day, who am I supposed to listen to? What part of Christianity is about how I feel or what I want? All of Christianity is self-sacrifice. I'm giving myself over to God. I'm giving myself to service of others. That is what Christianity is. And it is no different when it comes to that of authority and respecting authority. But what did God put this in place for? You see, God gave a specific reason for the government's establishment. I appreciated the scripture reading this morning, going through Romans 13, 1 through 5, and what he was describing was part of that role. He said, government, the authorities, are a terror to evil works. They are not a terror to good works, according to him. Now, someone might say, well, Josh, hold on. Governments aren't a terror to good works. What about Rome? Rome persecuted Christians. But let's remember something as well. The government of Rome persecuted the church, yes, but as a result of that, what happened? As a result of that persecution, God used the evil of men to further the goodness of the gospel. He used the wickedness of a government to spread Christianity to the four corners of the world. But what did Rome also do for the church? They had a common language across the world that made for an easier spread of the gospel. They had the Pax Romana, the Roman peace that allowed travel pretty much anywhere within the empire, and you have the safety of the Roman military. They built roads that made for easier travel as well. So even with the wickedness of such a vile empire, God was able to use that for His benefit. Now, yes, there are terrible things that governments have done, atrocities that governments have put in place, but even the most tyrannical governments deal with real crimes. Murder is persecuted even in a tyrannical government. Theft is still persecuted in a tyrannical government. There are still good things that even an evil government can do. Now, when we're looking at this point, God told the people in the book of Romans, through the pen of Paul, He described to them that they are to be subject to those authorities. In our country right now, we do have a blessing, because if our government does violate its mandate, we have means of calling that out, means of standing against that, and in many cases have been able to change very evil policies. But in the day and age that was written, a Christian had no say in what happened in their government. A Christian had no say in what was taking place. They just had to grin and bear it. And many of those policies resulted in the death of their friends, their family, their colleagues, everyone. But they were still to be subject to the rules and laws of Rome. Why is that? Why would God tell us to do that? It doesn't really make sense. If a government is evil, should we not stand against that? Friends, what was some of the very first attacks on the church? What were the enemies of the church trying to label Christians as? Rabble-rousers, rebels, anti-government groups. Not a one of those things were true. Not a one of those things were true about the church. And remember the day and age in which they were living as well. The Jews were waging basically a terrorist war against the Roman Empire. One of the 12 disciples, in fact, was known as a zealot, Simon the Zealot. A zealot was one who was a cutthroat, one who would attack Roman officials, Roman military, in fact. They would do all these terror attacks. Christians are to be above reproach, above blame. Whatever attacks people throw against us, they're not to stick. Christians are not to be those who want to thumb their nose at the government. Rather, they want the government to see the goodness of God. And what's the easiest way for that to be seen? How we live. The actions of one affect the actions of another. Imagine if the first century church had actually been as vile as the Romans had played them out to be. Imagine if the Romans actually did see the church trying to attack Roman soldiers, Roman officials, trying to cause problems. Do you think the church would have grown like it did? What shows more courage, a criminal being persecuted for their actions or an innocent man being persecuted for nothing? What motivates more people to action? What shows people more goodness? We see throughout the history of the first century church that Christian after Christian was martyred for their faith. And as a result of that, many people saw what was taking place. Remember the Roman centurion when Jesus was brought up on the cross and the darkness came upon him. What was his statement? Truly, this was the Son of God. Self-sacrifice. The easy thing to do is to become angry. The easy thing to do is to want to stand against those who are quote-unquote causing us problems. But as Christians, we take the loss. Not because we want to just allow all this evil to take place. In fact, whenever we have the opportunity, we are to stand against those things. But the battles that Christians fight are for the glory of God, not the glory of man. Countless revolutions in history have had good intentions. We want to bring freedom to the people. We want to have equality with everyone. We want to try to tear down this evil government that we've had, only for the new government to come in place and be worse than the first. It's fascinating when you read the accounts of history how unique America's revolution was. How unique it was that it all came together, because not even a few years later, France had a very similar revolution, and it was not the same. Streets ran with blood from governors and clergy and everyone else that they deemed to be an oppressor. Christians are to be those who try to change the world around them without hurting others. We care more for the soul than for the comfort here on earth. See, Christians we're not trying to make this world more comfortable. Why would we try? Why would we seek to make everything more comfortable here on this earth when we know what's waiting for us beyond? We're not trying to prepare someone to have a better life here, but to have an incredible life hereafter. That's our goal. That's our purpose. God established this government to punish the evil deeds of man, to put them in their place. But also, governments are often God's method for executing judgment. If we read the book of Judges, you're going to find out very quickly that very few of those governments that God put in place to punish Israel were good governments. Many of them were barbaric in nature. But God was using them for His purposes. He was using them to punish His people for the wickedness they had been doing, the wickedness they had been promoting. You see, many times we look at history and we say, well, there's no reason that a government should come in and oppress. But what was Israel doing in many of these instances when the government came in and began to oppress them? Sacrificing children? Committing pagan acts? Living lives that were so immoral that God Himself was appalled by what was taking place? See, Israel liked to play the victim over and over again, just like many in the world like to do. But sometimes judgment and justice is not a pretty picture. It's not a comfortable thing. Remember how God instituted all this from the beginning. Cain kills Abel, and so legally speaking, God's legal systemly speaking, Cain should have been killed for his crime. But He spared him. Why? Because God was trying to show this is not revenge, this is justice, and justice comes on my terms, not yours. Not yours. Governments only are allowed to exist because God allows them to be there. If God decided tomorrow that America's time was up, America would fall. See, we don't live for the nation in which we live and preside. No. We live for a greater kingdom. And our authority, first of all, is in heaven, but we do subject ourselves into the authorities. Why? To try to help others to see the goodness of God. To show others who He is, to show others that, yes, in spite of all of this, there's something better. There's something better. Governments have been used also to save God's people. In 2 Chronicles 36, 22, and 23, God's people have been in bondage for many, many years, and God put in place a man by the name of Cyrus the Persian. Now, if you know anything about Cyrus and his history, he was a very wicked man. But God used him to deliver His people because Cyrus came into power, and one of the first things he does is he says, you know, you're going home. You're going home. I received a vision from God. You're going home. All you Jews who have been in persecution, all you Jews who have been in bondage, all of you Jews who have been slaves, you get to go home. A wicked man did good. A wicked man allowed God's people to return home. Why? Because God said so. As vile and wicked as Pharaoh was to the Israelite people in the book of Exodus, even he could not stand against God. And he was as hard-hearted as they come. God has used evil people to further His goodness. So the purpose of government is to punish evil, but also it is a means of executing judgment and delivering His own people. But what is the church's relationship to the government? You know, it's consistently the case that whenever you put a PowerPoint together in one format, when it transfers to another, sometimes it does that. And sometimes you can't read it. But that's what it says, the relationship of the church to the government. What is our relationship to the government? Well, the first main point here of what we're discussing is Christians are to follow God first and foremost. Notice a pattern here? Both points start with the same thing. We follow God first and foremost. Acts chapter 5, verses 28 and 29, they said we ought to obey God rather than men. Under what circumstances? When the authorities of that day were telling the disciples not to preach in Jesus' name. Not to tell people about Christ, not to further His goals. And what do they say? We obey God rather than men. That isn't your place to tell us what to do. God gave us a command, and His authority supersedes yours. We follow God rather than men. So there we have an instance. Government tells us to do things that are against God. What is our statement to be? No. No. Now somebody say, Josh, that doesn't sound like obeying the government. That doesn't sound like we're being in subjection. That's true. Because we're in subject to the government as long as that government allows us to be in subject to God. That's the simple nature of it. If they tell us to do something that is against God, we refuse. Because my soul is more important than that person's feelings. And the authority of God is greater than man. There are circumstances that God gives us a way out. Now, this is not something that's new. We talked a few weeks ago about the nature of marriage and divorce. Remember that? God says that divorce is something He never wants to be the case, but He gives it under what circumstances? When it violates the contract. When it violates what has been put in place, you are no longer in bondage to that. Not because He wants that to be the case. God does not want it to be the case that His people suffer under a government, but there comes a time when lines have to be drawn. Lines in the sand have to be put in place. The Christian's role is to help the community around them to see the Lord. First and foremost, that is our goal. That is our purpose. There is a mistaken idea in our world that taking the loss is a sign of weakness. That not acting is a sign of weakness, that you are just complicit. The reality is, when someone slaps you in the face, what's harder to do? Not slap them back or deck them across the face? Which is harder? You'll even see people when that happens. They get slapped, and the first thing, they want to. That's what I want to do. But I know better. I know better. That won't be good for me. That won't be good for God. The same thing is true for us. Our job is to try to help the community around us. I said this before when I was living in Arkansas, and it's a haunting message to me. If the doors of this church were closed, would the community notice? Would anyone notice? If the doors closed forever and no more meetings took place, would anyone know or care? Friends, when the church showed up in the first century, the entire community was up in arms. Why? Because they changed the world around them. They changed the lives of those around them. Should we not do the same? Should we not be the same? That when the world is around us living an ungodly way, they look at us and they see something different. Something that is separate from what they're doing. I've said before and I'll say it again. If someone never has a problem with you, if you never have any conflict with others, it might be time to start looking at our lives. Because maybe we're not having conversations we should be having. Maybe we're not standing for things we should be standing for. Christianity is to make a difference to those around them. Yes, by how they live first and foremost, but also by what they do. In the Roman Empire, it was a common thing. If you had an unwanted child, you simply threw it out on the street. That child would fend for itself. Maybe they lived, maybe they didn't. It became the case in cities like major cities such as Rome that children would start be dropping off in the Christian quarter. Places where Christians were. Why? Those children would be taken care of. They would have a place to stay. They would have food. They'd be taken care of. Remember at the end of Acts chapter 2 that it said that the church had favor with all the people, and the Lord added to the church daily such as should be saved. No, we're not to have good rapport with people who hate the church. But it is the case that we should be doing good for those around us. Remember what the first three things that the church put in place. Following God, listening to what He says, studying His Word, obeying the mandates that He's put in place, supporting one another through benevolence, and evangelism. Those were the first three that God put in place to show what the church is supposed to be. So the church's relationship to the government is to help the community. You're tired of the government interfering in your homes and your lives? Take care of it yourself. Take care of the community yourself. Gone on a trip, to the nation of Greece a few years ago. And I was talking to the tour guide that was walking us through the city, and he said that crime in the city was below 1%. This is a pretty large city. I said, what on earth is that for? Why is it less than 1%? He said, I can tell you what every one of us says. We say, first of all, someone has a problem, someone loses their job, someone's in trouble, the family helps first and foremost. If the family's not able to help, the church helps. He said, the government never gets to you. They never get that far. He said, we take care of our own. We support our own. It's not necessary that the government steps in. That's something that many times people forget, is they say, well, I'm so sick of this happening. People who take care of themselves usually don't have the government show up. People who do what they need to do for their community, they support their community, usually it's not necessary that the government shows up. Christians are to be change agents in their own communities. No, we're not simply purely a benevolence group or a charity organization. No, that's not who we are first and foremost, but we are to care for those around us. We are to try to help in whatever ways we can. Part of what God put in place. But finally, We render to the world what belongs to the world, and we render to God what belongs to God. What do I mean by that? Jonathan Medley did a great job Wednesday night going through this point in Mark chapter 12, where Jesus tells a group of people that came to him, they said, "Is it lawful for us to pay tribute to Caesar or no?" Remember, this was a trap for Jesus. They were trying to get him in trouble with the government, saying, "Oh, he says you shouldn't pay taxes." And what does God do? He says, "Give me a coin. Show me one of these coins. Whose inscription is on the front of that coin?" They said, well, Caesar's. He says, "Render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's." Pretty simple statement. Short, sweet, and to the point, as we like to say. Friends, we render to God what belongs to God first and foremost, which is what? My life, my ambitions, my goals, everything about me. Everything about me belongs to Him first and foremost. Everything else is secondary. I belong to Him first and foremost. Remember, in James chapter 1, he describes us as the first fruits of His creatures, the very best that He created. We were made in His image, Genesis chapter 2. Romans chapter 12, verses 1 and 2, that as Christians we are to present ourselves a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable unto God, which is our reasonable service. That's my goal, is to give myself to God first and foremost. The purpose of government, the purpose of authority, is to try to keep in check what was broken. If man had never sinned, government would never be necessary. Because we have an authority that supersedes all. It's not, government doesn't exist because God's unable of taking care of things Himself. But my authority belongs to God. The way I dictate my life, the way I live my life, should come from His word only. As long as I'm allowed to do what I need to do, as long as nothing is stopping me from doing what God said, it's not my job to interfere. Who is our authority this morning? Who calls the shots in your life? We've gone through and we've talked about the authority of God. We've talked about the institutions that He put in place. Who has authority in your life? Is it you? Do you call every shot in your own life? Every decision you have to make purely comes from your own mind, your own will, or whatever you want? Friends, it's time for a change. It's time to make things different. Because if it's all about me, I can't get me to heaven. I'm not capable of offering what God has promised. If our authority is God and God alone, then the changes that I make, the life that I live, should be focused on what does He want? How does He feel about things? This morning, maybe you are not yet a member of the Lord's church. Maybe this is some of the first you've heard about. We're happy to sit down and study with you so you can understand more. Maybe you understand that I need to make changes in my life because God is the authority. He is the one who's above all, and that's who I want to follow. He made the path available. Let's hear the word. According to Romans 10:17, believe it to be true, John 8:24. Upon believing, understanding this is reality, I'm willing to repent of all of my past sins. I understand where I was before. I know that I need to put my trust and my authority in God, according to Acts 17:30. And based upon that repentance, that changed mind, which brings a change of life, I'm willing to confess that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. He's exactly who He said He was. I'm going to follow after Him, according to Romans 10:10. Based upon that confession, we'd be happy to baptize you into Christ this very morning, bearing that old man of sin, raised to walk in newness of life, according to 1 Peter 3:21 and Acts chapter 8. If you have any need this morning, there's no reason to wait for a better day, no reason to wait for a more convenient season. Others thought they had much more time. We don't really know what tomorrow holds. If you're a member of the Lord's church and you want to follow after what God says, you want to do what's right, but maybe you have things that are amiss, maybe you have problems that you're dealing with, that's what we're here for. You can make your life right with God again this very morning. 1 John 1:9, that's what He wants from you and from me, is to be a part of His kingdom. If you have any need, don't hesitate. Don't wait for a better day. Come now as together we stand as we sing.